The church had been decorated with wildflowers gathered from the fields, their scent heavy in the air. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring in anticipation. She stood there in her mother's old dress, clutching the bundle in her arms, the baby girl who had entered her life just weeks before. Every face in the room seemed to weigh on her, searching for flaws, whispering judgments. She tried to steady her breath, telling herself that this was her chance at a fresh start, that the man she was about to marry would keep his promise and give her and the child a place to belong. But as the minutes dragged on, the whispers grew louder. The groom never appeared. The door stayed closed. She felt the sting in her chest as realization pressed down on her. She had been left alone. The baby squirmed in her arms and whimpered, as if sensing the shame that wrapped itself around her mother. Tears filled her eyes, not just for herself, but for the tiny soul she carried, the child who would grow up with the shadow of abandonment if she failed now. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided her eyes, others wore smirks of pity, and a few shook their heads as if this was what they had expected all along. She felt the walls closing in. She wanted to run, to disappear, to hide herself and her daughter from the cruel eyes of a world that never forgave women like her. She turned toward the door, clutching the baby tight, her heart pounding with the humiliation of a bride discarded before vows could even be spoken. That was when he entered. The church door creaked open, and the silence fell heavy. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in simple ranch clothes. His hat shadowed most of his face, but the hard set of his jaw was clear. He was known in the town, though not well, spoken of in hushed tones. The silent rancher. He rarely came into town except for supplies, kept to his land on the edge of the valley, worked his cattle without help. Some said he was cold, others said he was hiding from his past. Nobody really knew, but in that moment, he walked straight toward her. His boots struck the wooden floor with purpose. She froze, unsure what to do, clutching her daughter tighter, the baby's soft cry breaking the silence. He stopped in front of her, removing his hat slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was no judgment in them, no pity. Just a steady, unwavering look that seemed to reach deeper than anyone else ever had. Without a word, he extended his hand. Her lips parted, her heart racing with confusion. She stared at him, searching for meaning. The murmurs behind her rose again, shock rippling through the crowd. No one understood why he would step forward, why he would claim what another man had so carelessly discarded. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Why?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes flicked to the child, then back to her, and something in his gaze told her everything. He saw them. Not as burdens, not as a scandal, but as something worth protecting. Her fingers shook as she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, grounding her when she felt she might collapse. The baby's cries softened, as though soothed by the sudden strength surrounding them. He led her from the church, past the stunned crowd, past the whispers, past the shame that had clung to her for so long. Outside, the air was sharp and cool, carrying the scent of dust and horses. He helped her into his wagon, then carefully, almost reverently, adjusted the blanket around the child. She studied him as he climbed onto the seat beside her, reins in his calloused hands. His silence was not emptiness, it was a kind of strength she had never known before. The wheels creaked as the wagon rolled forward, carrying her away from the place where she had been broken. She held her baby close, eyes stinging with tears she didn't try to hide this time. A part of her still trembled, afraid of what came next. But another part, deeper, quieter, began to hope. The silent rancher said nothing, but the way he kept glancing at the baby, the way he kept his shoulders squared as though he bore not just his burdens but now hers too, told her more than words ever could. For the first time in a long while, she felt that maybe she hadn't been abandoned after all. And as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and crimson, she knew her life had changed forever. Would you like me to expand this into a full 3,000-word continuation, where their story slowly unfolds on the ranch, how silence gives way to trust, hardship shapes their bond, and love grows between them? The wagon rattled down the dusty road, carrying them away from the church, away from the humiliation that had nearly crushed her. She held her baby tight, feeling the child's tiny breaths against her chest, and though her own heart still quaked, she realized that each turn of the wheel pulled her further from the shame and closer to something unknown. She glanced at the man beside her, his broad shoulders rigid, his profile carved in the fading sunlight. He said nothing, and somehow that silence was less frightening than the laughter or whispers she had left behind. Her mind raced, unsure of what had just happened. Why had he stepped forward? What had possessed a man who hardly spoke to anyone, a man with no reputation for seeking company, to offer his hand to her, a woman discarded and disgraced? She didn't know if he pitied her, if he wanted something in return, or if there was some reason she couldn't yet see. All she knew was that he hadn't let her drown in the eyes of the town. He had pulled her out, without a word. As dusk deepened, the valley stretched wide, painted with purples and shadows. The ranch came into view slowly, first the line of fencing, then the barn, weathered but strong, then the house, standing solitary against the horizon. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, and it seemed to rise out of the earth like it belonged to the land itself. She had never been this far out before, and the quiet unsettled her. No neighbors in sight, no lanterns glowing from other houses, just open land, cattle grazing in the distance, and the cry of a lone hawk cutting the sky. He drew the wagon to a halt before the porch, climbing down first, then turning to offer her his hand. She hesitated, her pride warring with her fear, but the baby shifted in her arms, and she let him steady her as she climbed down. His touch was brief, businesslike, but strong enough to remind her again that he was not a man of hesitation. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. It was plain, sparsely furnished, but neat. He lit a lamp, its glow filling the room with warmth. She sank into a chair, cradling the baby as the silence pressed between them. He moved with a quiet efficiency, setting a kettle on the stove, placing bread on the table, pouring water into a basin. It was as if he knew what to do without needing to be told. At last she broke the silence, her voice soft, uncertain. "I don't understand why you did it." He paused, looking at her across the room. His eyes were steady, unreadable, yet not unkind. He finally spoke, his voice low, gravelly, as though it had forgotten how to form words. "Because no one else would." Her throat tightened. That was all he said, and yet it was enough to undo her. She lowered her gaze, stroking her baby's cheek, the child's tiny hand curling around her finger. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough." That was the end of it. He turned back to his work, and she realized quickly that he was not a man who explained himself. He simply acted, and that would have to be enough. The days that followed were strange, filled with an uneasy rhythm. She helped where she could, cooking what little she knew, sweeping the wooden floor, mending clothes. He never asked it of her, but she needed to do something, anything, to repay what she couldn't put into words. He rose early, long before dawn, tending to the cattle, mending fences, moving with the steady patience of a man who had only ever known hard labor. She watched him sometimes from the window, his figure cutting against the endless land, and wondered what loneliness had shaped him into such silence. The baby brought a new sound to the house, her soft coos and sudden cries breaking the stillness. At first, he kept his distance, watching from afar, his expression unreadable. But she noticed the way his eyes softened when the child gripped his finger, the way his shoulders eased when the baby fell asleep in her arms. One evening, when exhaustion weighed heavy on her and the baby would not stop crying, he took the child gently from her arms. To her astonishment, the baby quieted almost at once, resting against his chest as though she had found safety there. He didn't speak, didn't look for praise. He simply held her until she slept, then returned her as carefully as if she were made of glass. Something inside her shifted then. She had been abandoned at the altar, left with nothing but a child and the echo of shame. But here, in this quiet house with this silent man, she began to feel something she hadn't dared hope for: steadiness. Not grand promises, not flowery words, but the kind of strength that carried weight without needing to announce it. The townsfolk whispered, of course. She heard it when she went into town for supplies, the way women glanced at her, the way men muttered as she passed. They wondered why the silent rancher had taken her in, wondered how long she would last in such a place. Some pitied her, others sneered, but no one dared say it to her face. And when she returned home, the quiet of the ranch swallowed their voices, leaving her with only the steady rhythm of cattle, the soft coo of her child, and the unspoken presence of the man who had chosen not to leave her behind. Time began to weave its threads around them. The baby grew stronger, her cries louder, her smiles brighter. The ranch work never ended, and she learned to help, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, hanging laundry in the sun while the child played on a blanket nearby. She stumbled, made mistakes, burned meals, struggled with the endless chores, but he never raised his voice, never showed impatience. He simply fixed what needed fixing, showed her with quiet gestures rather than instructions, and let her learn. Sometimes, in the still of the evening, they would share a meal by the fire. She longed to fill the silence with words, to ask him about his past, about why he chose this life of solitude. But he rarely spoke unless necessary, and she began to understand that silence was his language. His actions carried meaning, chopping wood to keep the house warm, leaving a blanket folded neatly at her bedside, repairing the chair she broke without a word of complaint. Slowly, she realized she could trust the silence, could rest in it instead of fearing it. One night, a storm tore across the valley, the wind rattling the windows, thunder shaking the ground. The baby wailed in terror, and her own hands shook as she tried to soothe her. Then he appeared in the doorway, his lantern casting shadows on the wall. Without a word, he lifted the child into his arms, rocking her gently, his deep voice humming a tune so low she barely recognized it as a song. The baby quieted, pressing her tiny face into his shirt. She stared at him, stunned, tears stinging her eyes. She hadn't known he carried music in him. She hadn't known he carried such tenderness. When the storm passed and the baby slept, she whispered, "Thank you." He looked at her then, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment longer than usual. "She's safe," he said simply, before setting the lantern down and stepping away. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Slowly, carefully, the wall between them thinned. She learned the rhythm of his work, the patience of his silence. He learned the sound of her laughter when the baby did something unexpected, the sight of her determination when she struggled to master a task. There were no grand confessions, no sudden declarations. But a bond was forming, quiet and unyielding, like roots sinking deep into the soil. Sometimes, when the baby was asleep and the stars stretched wide above the ranch, she would find herself standing on the porch beside him. He never spoke of dreams or fears, but he would point to the constellations, tracing their shapes in the sky with a hand that had known too much work and too little rest. She would listen, feeling the vastness around them, and in those moments, she understood that he was giving her more than silence. He was giving her the world he lived in, piece by piece. Still, doubt lingered. She wondered what he truly saw in her, if he regretted the choice he had made in that church. One evening, when the weight of it pressed too heavily, she found the courage to ask, "Do you ever wish you hadn't stepped forward that day?" He turned to her, his gaze steady, unflinching. For a long moment he said nothing, and she feared she had overstepped. Then his voice came, low and certain. Not once. Her breath caught, and she realized then that though he might never drown her in words, the ones he chose carried the weight of stone. The seasons shifted. The child grew from a babe into a toddling little girl, her laughter ringing through the house, her small footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The ranch became not just a shelter, but a home. And though the world outside might still whisper, inside those walls there was something stronger than gossip, something more enduring than shame. The silent rancher had walked into a church and taken her hand without a word, and in doing so, he had rewritten the story she thought had already ended. Now, each day they wrote it together, quietly, steadily, with the kind of love that didn't need vows to make it real.